Time diaries are considered the gold standard for holistic time use data, but there are a few different ways to collect these diaries, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. My study asks whether a smartphone diary can provide better data than the more traditional 24-hour recall interview. I received a lot of support from a range of people, but Rosa Noemi Guit Antonio, Vanessa Lima Caldera Franceschini, and Veronica de Castro Lameda made important contributions to the design, implementation, and analysis of the study. The short answer to my question is that the interviews performed a lot better than my app in terms of completeness and obvious errors, and did not increase labor or transfer costs. But both are based on self-report, so I can't say whether one is more correct. But I still think that diary apps have a lot of potential, so I'll finish with some recommendations for what would make a better app than mine. I worked in the department of Sololá in Guatemala and in the city of Belo Horizonte, Brazil. The samples are not representative, but they have characteristics in common with many populations in low and middle income countries, and we can expect similar issues and challenges in other low resource settings. Most of the big national surveys are 24-hour recall surveys, which are retrospective and interviewer administered. Participants need to remember what they did, and they need to be able to estimate the time that they spent doing it. We know this is easiest for people to do when they have very regular routines, like with paid work or school, and harder when activities are irregular or brief, or in settings where clock time is not important, which is the case in many low-income countries. Interviewers cost money for salaries and transport, but they can also help participants reconstruct their days, and it's much easier to ensure consistency of interviewers than participants, which can be a problem for self-administered diaries. Self-administered diaries place a large burden on participants, which may lead people to refuse to participate or to do it poorly. But an electronic diary can compensate for some of the consistency issues with automated checks. It can save on labor costs, and if it's done in real time, there should be no recall bias. The weaknesses of both methods are exacerbated when our participants aren't college-educated Americans and Europeans. In low-income countries, many people may have completed only basic education. Filling out forms is a really culturally specific thing, so what we think is simple may not be. The official language may be a second or third language for a lot of people. All of these things could be true for immigrants in the US, but they're more widespread in low-resource settings. So it would seem that the dream method would be a self-administered method that could be completed in real time with relatively little effort and not require much personal interaction. I thought that a simple mobile phone diary might be less intimidating and less of a burden than paper, allowing marginalized groups in low-resource settings to participate. What would such an app look like? It should ask only for the most essential information, start and end time, and the activity. It should have a pre-selected list of activities, so there's no writing. People do more than one thing at a time, so they should be able to record multiple simultaneous activities using checkboxes. Because everyone makes mistakes or forgets things sometimes, they should be able to add activities in either before or after and make corrections. More from the systems end, I wanted to be able to update and translate the activity lists because I was going to be working in two very different places. The app needed to work even without an internet connection, but I wanted participants to be able to send the data remotely, mostly so that we could check that they were doing it. Because the idea was to have a tool for researchers with limited budgets, I wanted something open source and to use Android. I was pretty sure there must be an off-the-shelf app I could use, but I couldn't find any that had the characteristics I wanted. This was actually part of a larger GPS study, so the Artificial Intelligence and Data Science research group at Makerere University, whose programmers were creating the GPS app, also added a time diary to it. This is what the app looked like. The pink instructions are from a tutorial we used in Brazil. The phones were a ton of work. We had to train participants to use the app, and in Guatemala, we had to train them to use the phones at all. We also had to train them on what activities belonged in which categories, which was quite complicated. We sent a lot of reminders, and we provided individual support through phone calls and WhatsApp, and in Guatemala, we made in-person visits. An app has the potential to reduce labor costs, but that wasn't the case for us, even when data entry was taken into account. There were also equipment costs, although the phones were donated by the Educational Foundation of the network TIGO. And we provided data credit as an incentive to participants. Really, the bigger problem was that we just got a lot fewer diaries. Of the 81 participants who installed the app, 25 did not submit any mobile diary data, yielding an overall response rate of 69%. This is compared to the interview, which had a response rate of 100%. A few had problems with their phones that resulted in the diaries being erased, but most did not give any reason for non-response. This graph shows the proportion of participants whose diaries met criteria of quality and completeness out of those who installed the app. They were supposed to do 2 days each. We considered 12 hours to be a complete diary day. Most participants slept for 8 or 9 hours, so should have been awake for close to 15 hours on the diary day. The second bar from the bottom shows the proportion of participants with 12 hours on at least one day. And we can see that less than half of participants had 1 full day, and very few had 2. If a method is better at capturing brief or transient activities, which we'd hoped for the diary, we'd expect there to be more episodes per day. But in fact, the interviews had a lot more episodes on average than the diaries. The mean number of interview episodes in both countries was 17, which is much higher than the mean of 12 for diaries in Guatemala and 6 in Brazil. The lower number of diary episodes in Brazil than Guatemala is partly because the errors in Guatemala were mostly related to mixing up AM and PM and could be corrected, whereas the errors in Brazil were what I'm calling improbable simultaneous activities. This screenshot from Guatemala shows someone mixing up AM and PM in the second entry. This participant in Brazil was shopping, reading, studying, visiting relatives at the doctor, eating, sleeping, and bathing or getting dressed, all from 11:30 to 9:30. And this is one of the diaries where we had to throw out everything. Given these sorts of errors, my first few recommendations relate to limiting simultaneous activities and having built-in checks. A soft check is one that asks, do you really want to do that? But lets you continue if you click yes, which can accommodate some situations you didn't anticipate. Hard checks that won't let you advance can be frustrating to users, but are sometimes reasonable, like an app used with illiterate agricultural workers in Zambia that prevents more than 3 activities at a time. I think the app should allow users to correct their entries, but it would be easier for them to recognize that they need to if the app gives them some feedback, either visually or by flagging gaps or by noting things like how many times they did certain activities or for how long. There are all kinds of things you can add to an app, but I really caution about adding too much because it's a lot easier for a participant to quit filling out a diary they find burdensome than to stop an interview midway through. Also, there are just more things that can go wrong. In low-income countries, iPhones are rare, and the process for getting apps onto the Apple platform is more complicated. So I recommend using Android and putting the app on the Google Play Store so participants can reinstall it after they accidentally delete it. A few final things. Even a simple phone diary requires more participant effort than an interview, so getting some buy-in from participants is important. The fact that the Guatemalans were part of an existing program and we spent more time training them up front made a difference in the amount of effort they invested. If you're working in a high-income country, this process might be a lot smoother and you can get by with less in-person training, but you will need to invest more in training your participants. In addition to my co-authors, I received support from many people in the field and at Princeton, and funding from several Princeton programs, including the Center for Health and Wellbeing Grand Challenges.